Is the United States now at war with Venezuela? Welcome back to another edition of Byline with Ben Dennis. That is the optimal question headed into this work week. Folks coming back from the holiday break, hopefully you had a relaxing time. Lawmakers are also coming back. Congress is back in session. They've got a big plate ahead of them. They are going to have to take a bite out of this massive surprise Venezuela issue after the United States and our armed forces captured the president, dictator, Nicolas Maduro, however you would like to label him, clung on to power after many saw that he handily lost the last election. In 2024, his re-election bid. Well, now he's in the United States. He will be facing a judge in New York. He's currently being held out of jail in Brooklyn. The allegation, well, he's facing drug trafficking charges. The boats were bombed leading all up to this. We're going to dive into this in a second. But Congress is going to have to answer some questions. Did they have the authority in order to allow this to happen? Why were they not briefed? We're going to get into that. But we're also diving into an interview I have today about the midterm strategy for Republicans who seem like they're facing an uphill battle right now. President Trump's polling numbers are not good. Trump's not on the ballot for the midterms, but don't forget, the midterm elections are typically a bellwether of how the president is doing, no matter who is in power. His polling numbers are not good, and the affordability issue, if he is tackling campaign promises, that's a big question as well from Republicans. I have an interview with the head of the Republican committee in Arlington County, Virginia. This is a suburb just outside of Washington, D.C. Virginia is a purple state, if you will, but Arlington County is largely Democratic in terms of the electoral base. And I asked Matthew Hart, he is the head of the Arlington County Republican Committee, what he has learned in a largely blue geographic area that possibly national Republican leaders do not know or would not know about the current state of the electorate, given that it's not necessarily a purple area, and he has to somewhat find ways to stay competitive and make sure that local Republican leaders are getting elected to office, even if typically members of Congress, presidents are not elected with a pathway through Northern Virginia like Arlington County. So my conversation with Matthew is about the strategy that Republicans, he thinks, should be deploying headed into the midterms to either keep the House and Senate or make sure that their losses in the House, which it appears by analysts is going to be taken by the Democrats, and if that is the case, how large. We asked topics of the day. I got into the Venezuela issue as well as really pressed him on if the Republicans can actually sell the affordability issue to their voters, if Congress is not doing anything on the issue, if President Trump is bucking the issue and saying that affordability is a, quote, Democrat hoax. Matt even brought that up. He's not happy with, or at least he was, let's just say, upset that President Trump had said that at the tail end of 2025. We had these critical elections and gubernatorial races in New Jersey and Virginia. Democrats won the mayoral election in New York City. I asked him what lessons might have been learned out of this election, as well as what lessons might have been learned thus far after Donald Trump assumed office for a second term. I also pressed him on the health care crisis that many families, millions who relied on these Obamacare tax credits, are going to be facing after these tax credits, again, were not extended by Congress. So 2026 is going to be difficult for these folks and their health insurance premiums that they're going to have to be paying out of pocket. You're going to want to hear his answer after I said, is it a good idea politically for Republicans to sign on with Democrats right now and at least pass these tax credits until the midterms, or at least prior to the midterms, in order to bolster their chances for the election? You're going to want to hear his answer on that. I also asked him if he thought a bigger risk would be alienating the Republican base or alienating the swing voter. Matthew has an interesting take on the state of affairs across the country. He also says that he helps prop up conservative activists across the country. He's also got some connections with the Republican National Committee. So I thought that now would be a prudent time as we enter 2026 when the midterms are just, well, goodness gracious, 10 months away. 10 months for candidates to develop a message and tell their voters that they are worthy of representing them in Washington, D.C. So with that, We're going to get into our conversation with Matthew Hurt. And joining me now is Matthew Hurt. He is the chairman of the Arlington County Republican Committee. He is also involved with the Republican National Committee. He also says that he helps conservative activists nationwide to organize. Matthew, I appreciate you joining. Thanks.
Ben, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
Of course, we have talked previously in my local news capacity here in Washington, but I really wanted to spend some more time with you to dive in on messaging ahead of the midterms. Whether you like it or not, we're in the year of our Lord, 2026, and 2025 flew by. It seems like every year the calendar is just ripping off the pages. November's going to be here before we know it, and I really want to digest what Republicans can talk to voters about right now and find some success in November, maybe possibly tweak messaging issues that may be apparent right now, may have happened during the last election in Virginia, which you are keenly aware of after Abigail Spanberger, the Democrat, won the governor's mansion from the Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl-Sears. But let me quickly get to you on this, and that was news of the day. Nicolas Maduro, president, dictator of Venezuela, however you'd like to title him, captured in the dead of night along with his wife, flown into the States, now going to be facing charges for drug trafficking. So the first question I have for you, Matthew, is how do you think the president's messaging has been on this to sell this to the American people thus far?
Ben, it's a great question. I think that some of Donald Trump's supporters will ask, how is this America first? But I've spent the last 24 hours watching videos of Venezuelans, both in the United States and I would say across the Venezuelan diaspora broadly around the world, who are celebrating this. The big question for me is, how does this play out in the midterms with all the other issues among Hispanic voters? And I think that this is something, as the president talks about drug boats and national security, this sort of aligns with a lot of his agenda. I do think as Americans move into the midterms, they will ask, how does this impact affordability? How does this impact my family on the ground in communities across the country? So there's a bit of a struggle here, I think, with the president being able to communicate the benefits of this to the average American voter.
How would you suggest that the president tackled this? What kind of messaging talking points?
Well, I do think President Trump was elected on securing the border. I think there's an element of this, given the drug boats and that narrative that he and Secretary of State Marco Rubio have used. But I also think that many Americans are tired of endless war. We saw what happened with sort of the Bush wing of the Republican Party in Iraq and Afghanistan. I do think there are stark differences between the military adventurism of a John Bolton-style Republican or Dick Cheney and what we're seeing play out here. I'm cautiously optimistic that we don't go into a nation-building activity for the long term. And I think most Americans are tired of that kind of thing, left, right, and center. So I do think there are elements of this that will play out in the midterm elections. I think this is potentially a win for President Trump, so long as we don't get bogged down in a quagmire in South America.
Well, to your point, it's recent history, what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, a lot of scrutiny about America's involvement and able to stabilize a government. And so I believe that's the point you're getting there. You don't want a long-term presence, at least America controlling the Venezuelan government. Is it because we have not succeeded in the past?
Yeah, the history of nation building is largely unsuccessful. I do think, one of the concerns here in the early, we're just 24 hours after this at this point, is who is the United States planning to prop up? And it seems like the current regime, which Nicolas Maduro held, is still in power. From the assessments I've read over the last 24 hours, people don't seem to think that the opposition could go into government and hold the institution of government and the military. And so there seems to be, there may be a little bit of a power struggle given the current regime, the authoritarian regime, which is in play, which disregarded the outcome of the 2024 election in Venezuela. So I'm curious to see the timeline on when they hold possibly a general election to give the voters another choice to install a government that is representative of the Venezuelan people.
Well, and to your point, the president has already come out and been a skeptic of Maria Machado to lead Venezuela, but there's also, whether there's debate about domestic policy in Venezuela, there's also going to be what seems like significant debate between these oil reserves that Venezuela has and the United States, because the current government, by accounts thus far, the vice president, she had said, we're not going down without a fight on this issue.
Yeah, and you look back historically at Venezuela, and Hugo Chavez, when he came into power, oil production diminished. They nationalized oil production, and it cut into a third or a fourth of what they were producing prior to Chavez's elections. Venezuela is an opportunity for the people of Venezuela to produce oil, to mine for gold and other natural resources. It is a resource-rich country, one of the most resource-rich countries in the world, and there is no reason why the people of Venezuela, the economy of Venezuela, cannot flourish and be a symbol for the people of South America broadly. And so I'm interested. I'm watching cautiously. What I don't want is a war for oil. I don't think that we're seeing that. But I do think, stepping away from the nationalization of the production and extraction of national resources, there's a way for the people of Venezuela to harness that energy and that opportunity without the people owning, and by that I mean the government owning those means of production and producing the natural, refining, and exporting the natural.
Do you actually think that the White House is not going to take some of this oil for our own?
Ben, it's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm always the war for oil argument is an easy argument for opponents to make. And we didn't really see that in Iraq, and I don't think that we're going to see it here. Again, it's really too early to tell. President Trump is a businessman, and so there are business elements to this. I ultimately think, in watching again the hundreds of videos of Venezuelans, both in Venezuela and around the world, particularly in Florida and other places with large Hispanic populations in the United States, that the people of Venezuela overall are excited and happy about the removal of Nicolas Maduro from the office of president, which he held, I think, and many Venezuelans think, illegitimately for a year or more.
Well, we're fresh into this issue, and by the time that this is published on a Monday, the talking points might completely turn on its head. So let me get to the meat and potatoes, and that is about the messaging ahead into the midterms. You are in an interesting geographic area for the electorate. Arlington County is reliably blue, and you are chair of the Republican committee in order to advance Republican interests within the county. So the first question that I want to ask you is, given the Democratic makeup of Arlington County and the strength of it just by the votes, what forces you to learn about the voters that national Republican leaders might not know?
Well, at the local level, my responsibility and my goal over the last several years has been to identify and mobilize Republican voters. In 2020, President Trump got about 23,000 votes out of Arlington County. And in 2024, given the efforts of the Arlington County Republican Committee, he increased the vote share by 13 percentage points. So from 23,500 votes to 26,500 votes, thereabouts. And so at the very local level, my first goal is to identify and mobilize every Republican voter who turns out, and I think who could possibly turn out. And that is a question I think we're going to ask as we go into the midterms. The second thing I look at is, what is the voting demographic in Arlington County? A majority of voters have some reliance on the federal government, or an auxiliary or ancillary organization, and so there is a natural opposition to somebody who's going to come in and cut the federal government, natural opposition to that. We saw it during the No Kings protest, very robust protest infrastructure in Northern Virginia, and particularly in Arlington. And so my goal here, for the most part, given our proximity to Washington, D.C., so many people are concerned about what's going on at the national level. My committee and my members are keenly focused on what are the local issues at hand. And those are, it is education, it is public safety, it's affordability. And affordability, I think, will be the primary messaging vehicle that both Democrats and Republicans will use heading into the midterm. So how do we sort of diminish those national issues and speak to the local issues? You don't ask the party affiliation of whoever is keeping the streets safe or whoever is making sure the teacher to pupil ratio in the schools is appropriate. And so we try to talk about those issues through a local lens and shy away from what's going on across the river.
I've got two follow-ups for you because it's one of my top notes, and I talk about it a lot with folks either on this podcast or separately, and that is the increasing nationalization of local politics. I talked with one political science professor, George Washington, and he says he doesn't think city council candidates should have to answer to what's going on in the Middle East because they have absolutely no control over it. Are you in support of basically taking the nationalization out of, it sounds like, of local issues and actually get to, the daily quality of life problems that people face?
I agree with that premise. I think that, again, Donald Trump isn't on the ballot for county board in Arlington. He's not on the ballot for school board in Fairfax County. And I think that is what we try to communicate at the local level. But, our proximity to DC makes it even more real for us. But these kinds of messaging complications are happening all over the country. Again, I think that, you step back and the two political parties in this country are a vessel. They don't have an ideology. They are filled by the people who show up, filled by the ideology or the philosophy of people who show up. And I think it's up to us to communicate at the local level what is important. And what you see in Northern Virginia, what does a voter want out of an elected official? They want somebody who has risen up through the civic infrastructure, who has solved local problems. In 2014, Arlington elected for the first time in a generation a non-Democrat to the county board who was ostensibly a Republican. He ran as an independent. And when the Democrats tried to attack him, most people knew him from the farmers market. They knew him from the PTA. They knew him from his neighborhood involvement. And so those are the kinds of successful candidates who could rise to and defeat, say, a Democrat at the local level who realistically only gets about 6,000 votes out of a primary or nominating process produced by the Democrats. So that is something that I'm keenly aware of and that we try to operate under, changing the reality or the mindset of voters as they think about who is at the local level and who represents them.
You mentioned the sheer number of federal workers or those who are bolstered by the federal government in Arlington County. How badly do you think these DOJ cuts are going to be when it comes to the ballot box in November?
Looking at the numbers from January of 2025 to the end of the year, I think in terms of real numbers, unemployment in Arlington went up about 2,500 people. And I would venture to guess that a majority of those people were cut through federal government cuts or contractors who were then their contracts were suspended by the federal government. It's a real issue. As someone who professionally works full-time in helping people find work, I don't want to see anybody unemployed. But what I do think is that Arlington County in Northern Virginia relies heavily on a federal government, which we can't put as much faith in. And I think all too often
Why not?
Well, from Democrat to Republican, from one election to the next, and even in the midterms, you have the spending priorities change, the spending habits change, and what we see is a president, and I don't think this is necessarily an incorrect philosophy, a president who wants to reduce elements of the federal government that he thinks and that our philosophy believes should be returned to the most local form of government. And what does that mean? It means cutting agencies that shouldn't have the authority, and perhaps even relocating agencies to a part of the country that makes the most sense. Does it make sense for the Department of the Interior to be housed in Washington, D.C.? Does it make sense for Housing and Urban Development to be housed in Washington, D.C.? Putting those agencies and departments in communities that rely more heavily on those services make a lot more sense, but at the same time, it displaces hundreds or even thousands of employees in Northern Virginia who have built families, bought homes, and secured a place here. I think, looking at the local government, there's a tendency of elected officials to promise for voters to vote based on the promises of elected officials rather than the outcomes of what their elected officials' policies do. And I think that's a problem that we see more strongly in Northern Virginia, particularly over the last few years as President Trump has sought to cut some of the federal government.
What's one national GOP talking point that you would tweak so that it lands better with swing voters?
I think the big conversation this year will be on affordability, and I think President Trump out of the gate fumbled this several months ago. He said affordability was a Democrat hoax. I think most voters, and even those in Arlington, but many outside of this area, they only think about elections when it impacts the bottom line. Can I make the mortgage? Can I buy a house? Can I put food on the table? Can I save for retirement? Are my kids in good schools? For many Americans, affordability has been an issue. And so the Democrats came out in late last year, late in 2025, talking about affordability. The president kind of shrugged that off. I think President Clinton did a pretty good job when he said, I feel your pain. That was something that he ran on in 1992. I think President Trump attempted to do something like that with a national speech before Christmas. I don't know if that landed with the American people. And so I do think that Republicans should speak to those kitchen table issues that most Americans think about when we get into August, September, and October of an election year.
Do you think that Donald Trump is making the same apparent mistake that Joe Biden did? It says the economy, it's great. Look at Wall Street. Look at the jobs reports. When they hear the word economy, they don't think about that. They think about how they can afford things.
Well, yeah. So there's the affordability part, and then there's the investment part. I will say under the first Trump administration and now, more Americans have more in retirement accounts than previously. And I think that is one element of it. If I look at and I just got my fourth quarter statement for my investment accounts, and they look really good. And I'm happy about that. But that is a long-term, I'm couple decades away from retirement. That's not something that I will be able to feel or experience for another 30 years or so. And so there are the intangible future items, retirement accounts, which look good, but then there are the tangible near-term items. And I think that's what most Americans vote on is what is happening right now. What's the cost of a gallon of gas? What's the cost of the grocery bill? And I think it would behoove Republicans, particularly President Trump and those on the ballot, to talk about those issues, either if they are solving them or if they at least hear them. I do think one thing, again, that voters want is some sort of immediate relief. And oftentimes what we do see in this is if Congress enacts something related to the economy or the president makes an executive action, we don't see the benefits or the downsides of that for 3 or 4 or 5 months. So I don't think we're going to see some of the benefits of the economic policies until March, April, May, which is also okay because, again, most voters don't tune in until midsummer.
What would you recommend Republican leaders do right now to try and get this healthcare issue resolved where premiums are skyrocketing right now?
Yeah, I just looked. We just had open enrollment at my employer, and luckily for us, the employer decided to maintain the plan and absorb some of that cost. But that's a real cost. That is something that Americans look at that immediately comes out of the paycheck every 2 weeks or however often they get paid. I think that there are healthcare opportunities. I think that since the passage of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, we've seen the cost of healthcare continue to rise. I don't think the answer is in more government control, more government solution, but I do think it is harder for people to conceive or to fathom what is possible if more Americans had more control over the healthcare decisions that they make on a day-to-day basis, be it in more individualized accounts or fewer restrictions and regulations. It is harrowing or concerning or even scary for someone to say, I don't know what happens if we embrace this healthcare opportunity. I certainly don't think it is in more command and control out of Washington. And I do think it is by empowering healthcare users to make more informed decisions. I just am not sure what that looks like as a policy outcome.
Well, I mean, it doesn't seem like you're alone on this. Republicans haven't gained a lot of traction in terms of an alternative for the ACA in the last 15 years. So let me ask you this. Do you think right now it's politically expedient for Republicans to team up with Democrats and say, hey, let's extend these ACA tax credits for those who do not have health insurance through their employer? I happen to. It sounds like you do as well, in order to make sure that people are not feeling this major hurt, this real cost, as you had said, going into the midterms.
It seems to me like that is kicking the can down the road. I was back home in Nashville over Christmas break, and I heard, it's so funny, I heard on the radio advertisements for healthcare options And the argument they made was these healthcare pools are more affordable than those available in the Affordable Care Act. So it seems like the market is trying to create that opportunity. I really hesitate to say Congress should, and by that I mean Democrats and Republicans going along with them, Congress should keep the current infrastructure in place. The current infrastructure was enacted not to be a long-term solution. I think these were Democrats acting in bad faith in passage of the Affordable Care Act, knowing that it would overwhelm the system, and I just don't think we should continue on that pathway.
If critics are right saying that, and I've heard this from Marjorie Taylor Greene among Republican critics, saying that Mike Johnson is taking cues from President Trump. He is not exercising the legislative power that House Speaker might be able to have right now. If that is true, and at least voters think that that is true, how do Republicans go home to their constituents in their districts and say, hey, we're getting things done, we're in the majority?
This is a significant problem for both parties. I think over the last 20 years, Congress has abdicated a lot of its responsibility to the executive branch. And that's why we have seen a rise under President Obama and first President Trump and President Biden, increased executive authority, increased legislation by executive fiat. I'm not a big fan of that. I think that Congress thought it was smart for them to say, oh, we'll just give the president more power and then we don't have to do it. And so we're in this democratic, small d democratic predicament where the Constitution outlines the responsibility of a legislative branch and an executive branch. And for the last 20 years or so, the legislative branch has said, we don't want to do that. We just want to give it to the president. And I think they are reaping what they have sown over the last 20 years or so. I am not sure what the solution to that is, except for Congress re-exerting its authority and saying, these are the responsibilities outlined under the Constitution that we should undertake. And I think there is a little bit of political pain. Members of Congress, members of the House who are up for re-election every 2 years, they are primarily concerned with getting reelected. And so it is hard for them to take those politically difficult votes. And even senators, you get a senator who's elected in, say, 2024, not up for reelection until 2030. He or she may take tough votes for the first few years, but then they shy away from it. So you get a third of the Senate who won't make tough votes 2 years before their election. So I'm not sure where to go from there. It would take political courage. And we have seen Marjorie Taylor Greene made those statements. And I think that I don't think she's wrong in that. And I think it'll take political courage. And I'm not sure that Republicans or Democrats have that ability in the near term.
How do Republicans go home? Back to my question, and we can have a completely separate conversation about term limits, as you had mentioned. What can Republicans say to their voters back at home right now and offer that they are getting things done?
Yeah, I think that the primary driver of the midterm conversation will be about affordability. And if they are working on items, if there's legislative solutions that are coming to the fore, even if they are driven by the president's agenda, for the most part, many of these things have to be enacted by the legislative body, by the House of Representatives, by the U.S. Senate. And I think that individuals can take ownership of that, can say, we are working to, reduce the cost of X or bring down healthcare costs. But those solutions have to actually be filed in the House and in the Senate.
Are you confident that that could actually happen?
I mean, you see things. I saw a text message from Senator Rand Paul to President Trump back before Christmas talking about healthcare opportunities from sort of a small L libertarian perspective. I think, something like that is beneficial. It depends on what's the political pain point for someone filing legislation. And if you file legislation, is it going to pass? If it'll pass the House, will it even make it to the Senate? And so again, it's that abdication of political authority. You could file as many bills as you want. And I often see elected officials say, well, I filed 200 bills this year. And that isn't really that's not a marker for success for me. It's what is politically possible. And I think there are Republicans who do want to get elected, who do want to get reelected, who could go in and file legislation and try to move that through the process and get it to the president's desk.
The president isn't, well, you could argue, is the president on the ballot in the midterms, every single time we come into a midterm election for any president. But do you think that Mike Johnson has the ability to present legislation on his own in the House without taking cues from the White House to try and address the affordability issue?
I don't know that he has to, Ben, but I do want to come back to your first point. Is the president on the ballot? And this is a significant problem for Republicans. Is the president on the ballot for Democrats? Yes, every single election. And we saw it in Virginia in 2025. Is the president on the ballot in 2026 for Democrats? He is absolutely on the ballot. For Republicans, particularly Republicans who voted for President Trump, he is not on the ballot. And many of them stayed on. We look in Southwest Virginia, the turnout from the 2025 gubernatorial election, and we saw a decrease across Virginia, but particularly in Southwest Virginia, of about 200,000 votes over 2024. And I think that is a problem that Republican candidates will have going to make the case for many Trump voters outside of the Beltway. They did what they were supposed to do. They went to the ballot in 2024. They submitted it. They got President Trump elected, and now they can just sit and wait until 2028 when J.D. Vance is the the ascendant nominee. And I think that will be a real problem for Republicans. Democrats are motivated because they are in a minority position. This happens in politics. Nothing moves unless pushed. Democrats are agitated because Donald Trump is in the White House. Republicans are complacent because they did everything they had to do. And this is going to be a significant problem for Republicans, mobilizing, motivating, and turning out voters who voted for Donald Trump in 2024 and maybe have checked out since.
What do you think is the bigger risk for Republicans in the midterms, alienating the base or failing to persuade the middle?
It's a mix of both.
I'm shocked that that's your answer.
If everybody who turned out in 2024, if all of the Trump voters who turned out in 2024 turned out again in 2026, and then Republicans hold the House and hold the Senate. But there are these voters in the middle, and I think this is where the Venezuela issue could potentially be an issue that motivates voters. One of these other pockets of electorate demographics who would turn out if something that happened in Washington or as a result of Washington directly impacted their lives. And is it healthcare affordability? Is it immigration? Is it crime? Is it, what are the issues? And identifying those individuals who say, you know what, I may not have voted for President Trump in 2024, but ever since my investment portfolio has increased, or the cost of living is decreased, or, my home country of Venezuela is now, free from the grip of Nicolas Maduro. Whatever those issues are, you have to look at the pockets of the electorate, those demographics, young women, Hispanic voters, African Americans, whoever they are, federal government employees, and say what issues speak to those groups, and then how do you message to those groups? This is not a one-size-fits-all messaging operation. Something that a blue-collar worker in Eastern Kentucky that motivates him or her to vote for Republicans is different than something that motivates a suburban mom or a first-generation American from South America. And so it takes identifying those issues and messaging specifically to those demographics on those issues.
Let me ask you about that. On affordability, which you continued to say is going to be the likely leading issue headed into the midterms. And by the way, Democrats say it too. It seems like that's the general consensus here. What is the best messaging for the base on affordability, the Republican base, and for swing voters?
I think that the messaging overlaps for both. I think that regardless of if you're a blue-haired federal government employee in Arlington, Virginia, or you are an electrical utility worker like my dad was in rural Tennessee, everybody is concerned. Can I make the mortgage, or can I buy a house? What are interest rates like? Can I put food on the table for my family? Can I save for retirement? And across the board, if one economic policy benefits a federal government employee in Northern Virginia, it very likely benefits somebody who isn't as reliant on the federal government in a rural place. So identifying messengers on those issues, I think that President Trump did a great job in the 2024 Republican National Convention at highlighting individuals who would benefit or who did benefit from his policies. And I think it takes identifying those individuals and using those messengers to communicate with their message. This is something that I talk about with conservatives all the time.
Is that a Hail Mary pass? If people aren't largely feeling that they're in a good spot, is it just kind of like fodder or the fog, if you will, to say, hey, these are not the droids you're looking for. Here's an example of how we're succeeding, even if you might not be.
Well, I think that it is certainly there are people who will benefit or who are benefiting from those policies and who will benefit from future policies or from the movement of policy to practicality. You'll be able to find anybody, Republicans will be able to find people who benefit from the current policies. Democrats will be able to find people who would benefit from a change in the policies. And you take those messengers. Again, I think this is something when I talk to conservatives who talk about outreach, and I'm using air quotes on outreach. Outreach means 8 weeks before an election, going to a group of African Americans and saying, "Hey, don't you benefit from these policies?" And oftentimes conservatives are confused when an older white man doesn't resonate with an African American audience. I say there are individuals. You don't have to change the message. You just change the messenger, somebody who is reflective of the community. And I think you look at the policies and you look at what Congress may promise or the elected officials may promise. You'll be able to find people who can speak to the benefits, either the real benefits that are happening in real time or the potential benefits of a continued Republican majority in Washington with President Trump.
Let me get you out on this. With the House coming back, well, with Congress coming back into session for calendar year 2026, what are the best agenda items to tackle in order to bolster their chances in the midterms? And what is there anything, to your knowledge, with your connections with the Republican National Committee and your sources, that something actually might come about with affordability?
Ben, I think it remains to be. I'm going to punt on this one. I think it remains to be seen. I do think that in American politics, if the president is of the party in power, he or she drives the narrative for that. I think that President Trump has surrounded himself with more smarter people in this term than he did in the first term. I think that
On what issues?
well, on any issues, I think that the people that he has moved through the process who've been confirmed or the staffing situations, you look at USDA, you look at housing and urban development, you look at small business, you look at Department of Education. I think there are just more competent, qualified people in this administration than there were in the first
The
administration.
Democrats would say that's completely the opposite in their mind.
Yeah, and they would, and I think there's a knee-jerk opposition to President Trump that I think has the potential to trip up Democrats in the midterm elections. What I've seen over the last 24 hours is countless numbers of people who have opposed President Trump on any number of policies who have an intimate understanding of the situation in Venezuela, and they have cautioned the New York Times, Democrats, and other Democrat messaging entities from saying you can't just say that what President Trump did in Venezuela is bad because almost everyone in Venezuela disagrees with you.
And what you're talking about, just to stop there, well, on the New York Times point, you're talking about the editorial board who came out and said that what he did was illegal.
Yeah, I think that there's a Venezuelan journalist who fled Venezuela. She was frequently on MSNBC or MS Now, who came out over the weekend and said this is a dangerous place to be messaging from. And President Trump has this unique ability to take an 80-20 issue, immigration, and currently I think Venezuela. We're going to see this play out, and force his political opponents to take the most unpopular position as a knee-jerk to orange man bad as a policy. Opposition to the party in power is not a policy prescription. It is not a solution. And I think that is one place where Democrats might find themselves in a bind over the next several months is because there is not a clear policy opposition to the president other than President Trump we oppose President Trump. And I think that is a dangerous place for Democrats in the long term, and particularly in this election cycle.
Do you think Republicans trip up in some cases too, where they'd say anything that Democrats do is bad and we don't care about coming to the middle ground?
Oh, I think that, the average American voter doesn't see solutions from the Democrats. I think where Republicans trip up is unyielding fealty to the president. I think that, as we head into midterm elections, is most people don't think about political long-term political outcomes, but we're looking at 2026, 2028, 2030. There's a presidential election in 2028. What happens after President Trump? And I think that a Republican Party can take cues from the president, who has changed the Republican Party, but they have to look further than that. What are these policy solutions that benefit long-term? Do think you look at congressional ratings, and Democrats are the lowest rating since the pollsters have started asking the question. So, Democrats are going to have troubles articulating a cogent opposition to President Trump beyond we just oppose President Trump. And I think that
They may have low polling, but they are in the minority.
well, yeah, but Republicans had low polling and have been in the minority. If you look at midterms, the 2010 midterm election was a significant win for Republicans, taking 86 seats in the House. And so I think that, again, polling is, you take a look at polling, it's a snapshot at a moment in time. One poll tells us very little. A series of polls tells us a narrative. And if Democrats continue into the summer at these poll numbers, it will drive a narrative that they don't have solutions. They're just in opposition to President Trump. And I think that would be a problem for them in November.
Well, and then the flip side of this, as you know, devil's advocate here, if the president's polling doesn't get better, that's not going to help Republicans in the midterms.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, again, we go back to is President Trump on the ballot? For Democrats, he's on the ballot every election. For Republicans, he's not on the ballot unless he's on the ballot. And I think that's a problem for Republicans.
He's on if he is, he's not if he's not. Matthew, I appreciate your time. Thank you, and let's stay in touch.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ben.
A surprise operation by military forces over this weekend. Did the United States have the legal authority to go into a foreign country, snatch their leader, and bring them back to the United States to face domestic charges? That's what we did in Venezuela. Those alleged drug boats were bombed leading up to this moment. Nicolas Maduro is now in New York State, reportedly at a jail in Brooklyn, as he is going to be facing charges for drug trafficking. His wife, too. It's going to be very difficult to find somebody who likes Maduro in Congress. Democrats largely don't like him. Republicans largely don't like him. They say he's an illegitimate president and held on to power after he lost the election in 2024. But Democrats are the ones who are saying the way the United States handled this was illegal. Republicans say, well, President Trump is essentially exercising the law. How are foreign countries going to see this? Is China going to feel like they have a pass to go into Taiwan? Does Russia feel more emboldened? Might Vladimir Putin try and do a snatch and grab of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky? How can America be the moral compass if there are many legal questions about the tactics of snatching Nicolas Maduro, capturing him, and bringing him to the States? Or is it justified? The White House says that he was trafficking drugs that killed Americans. Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas was on one of the Sunday shows, and he says that part of what Maduro had done in Venezuela, trafficking drugs, he says it killed hundreds of Arkansans and thousands of Americans. Is it justified for this guy to come to the States and face American courts? What do you think? I want to know. I hope you had some good takeaways from my conversation with Matthew of how he thinks that President Trump should be communicating the Venezuela issue to the public. He does not want to see endless war. He doesn't want to see the United States get into another elongated conflict if they don't have to. Don't forget, the Afghanistan pullout under Joe Biden was largely seen as disastrous. America could not establish Iraq as a functioning governing authority after 9/11. Not a great track record for the United States in trying to make sure that countries are rebuilt, that governments are reformed and sustained after American troops withdrawal. I found it interesting. Matthew also thinks that it's affordability that is going to be the biggest issue headed into 2026. How are Republicans going to sell that to voters if they can't get anything done in Congress? If Mike Johnson, as critics say, is continuing to take cues from the president. Well, the president, don't forget, he says that affordability, or at least he did, was a Democrat hoax. Now, granted, he came out at the end of 2025, and he did have that speech from the White House where he talked about how the White House was addressing the affordability issue. Vice President J.D. Vance went to Pennsylvania. He also made the case for how the White House was making it work. Is this just an example of the White House trying to say that we are fixing some of the problems that you're seeing and this is how we are doing it? Or are their efforts actually being felt by Americans? Is it the case that more people, as Matthew had said, are seeing more money into their retirement accounts? And granted, don't forget, that's considering that you have the ability to put that money aside. All right, back to the Venezuelan issue. The United States apparently wants U.S. companies, oil companies, to come in and revitalize their oil infrastructure in order to help Venezuela have a sustainable government. Questions, certainly, if the United States is going to be taking some of that oil for our own. President Trump had said that the revenues associated with some of this effort would help pay for the United States involvement. Another big question, President Trump had said that the United States would temporarily govern Venezuela. Well, that was this weekend in a press conference after he put a post on his social media account announcing that Maduro was captured. Secretary of State Marco Rubio came out on a Sunday show and said, no, the United States isn't going to govern Venezuela. Rather, they are going to ensure that trade of oil is stopped right now, that America has their thumb on how oil gets in and out of Venezuela, which has a very large oil reserve. There's some questions about whether Venezuela was actually tapping into it in a way that was economically positive for them under the Maduro administration. Trump has been on the record, says he wants to come in and make some adjustments. And on the world stage, Marco Rubio also said that he does not want China and Russia interfering with Western Hemisphere affairs. Is this conflict going to expand? Rubio had also suggested that the members of the Cuban government should be somewhat on edge right now. Trump, in a gaggle with reporters on Air Force One on Sunday, had said that he doesn't think we have to go into Cuba for whatever he's trying to achieve. We don't know. That's another big question. He thinks that the Cuban government is just going to crumble on its own. And he also brought up the idea of Greenland possibly being acquired, some of it, all of it, who knows, by the United States, acquired, seized, whatever verb you want to use, in order to advance America's national security interests. He says that there are Russian military vessels off of the coast of Greenland. He doesn't want that to happen. He quipped and joked with reporters saying, ask me in a month, ask me in 20 days about Greenland. I don't want to talk about Greenland right now. Well, it suggests that at some point he does want to talk about Greenland. Are voters going to be okay with America taking Maduro out of Venezuela? Are they going to be okay with the idea that somebody who was largely seen as clinging on to power was stopped from doing so? Or are they going to be increasingly concerned about the tactics of going into the country and capturing him? Or are they going to look that aside and say, it's fine, we don't really have that much interest in Venezuelan domestic policy, in politics in Venezuela? The weight of what was done over the weekend remains to be seen of how it impacts the vote come November. Is that also going to impact the vote in 2028 when folks are running for president? Okay, the looming healthcare issue is going to be brought about in Congress in 2026. Folks are going to start paying more when they go to the emergency room, when they go to the doctor's office, when they might want to have an elective surgery, if they ultimately have to provide some emergency care for their mother who is in a senior assisted living facility, for their kids who come down with intense flu right in the middle of flu season. Kids are going back to class, kids and germs and washing hands. Those viruses are easy to go around. I have a sister who is a school teacher. She teaches third graders in Maryland. Both of my parents are also educators in Pennsylvania. I am certainly well aware of how frequently they can get sick in the environments that they work in. Again, back to the healthcare issue. Are Republicans going to team up with Democrats? Is there going to be some type of agreement to, at least on the short term, maybe past the midterms, make sure that folks who are really impacted by these Obamacare-era tax credits are made whole? Might Republicans surprise us and 15 years after saying the Affordable Care Act needs to be scrapped after it was passed, come out with a plan, and a plan that could be considered? We haven't seen that since. Don't forget, Donald Trump was asked in the presidential debate with Kamala Harris, the sole one that we had in 2024, if he had plans to replace Obamacare. He said, I have concepts of a plan. That certainly made its rounds, at least in Democratic circles on social media. And in addition to the healthcare issue, are there other bills that might be presented to address the affordability issue. Will Democrats do it? Will Republicans do it? Might stimulus checks come about? There was the idea in 2025 that some of these checks would at least be labeled as a result of tariffs. Again, that was, at least in Democratic circles, largely seen as a political move if that were to happen. But it does appear that President Trump is now increasingly considering that affordability is certainly an issue that Republicans have to tackle. Take that year-end speech that he had in 2025, I had just mentioned. Do you have to? Do you have to let it linger? A lingering question is these additional, apparently 1 million documents related to the Jeffrey Epstein probe out of Manhattan that we learned after the Justice Department released their initial trove of documents that they had on these Epstein files. Many pages were redacted, some completely redacted. We know that the DOJ has already passed that deadline that was mandated by Congress. It is law in order to release these files to the public with redactions, according to the law, in order to protect the victims. Well, we don't know what it's going to come out of these additional documents. Are there going to be hearings? Are congressional leaders going to call members of the Department of Justice and either in a closed or open door setting ask about why they were redacted the way that they were? Were they sitting on these documents in Manhattan? Were they actually discovered late? What's in them? There's just so many unknowns here. Is Congress going to address AI in 2026? Some presidential candidates might have it as a platform in 2028 as AI continues to not be regulated largely by Congress. They seem to have an open door right now, these companies, to develop AI in any capacity that they deem necessary. A lot of safety checks that we learned over the holidays that leaders might want to focus in on. Some toys that are AI backed, that have AI software in them. In some cases, reportedly making sexual suggestions, answering where dangerous objects inside of the house might be, little toys that can act as fun little friends, if you will. Whatever happened to the good old teddy bear? Just my thought. I digress. All right, a couple future episodes that I'm looking to get on is the Republican Party possibly fracturing right now. Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of President Trump's long-standing, staunchest advocates, we know, you've seen the headlines, is breaking with Trump on many issues. And on this Venezuela issue, this is top of mind for someone who's like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who believes in the faction of MAGA that America should come first. We should not be inserting ourselves into foreign conflict, areas that do not advance our domestic agenda. I also want to dive into if Democrats are possibly leaderless. We know that during the government shutdown that had so many headlines at the tail end of 2025, that leaders had argued, they positioned themselves to try and make sure that these ACA tax credits were extended. Well, they folded. They didn't get them extended. The government was reopened. And will the questions about Democratic leadership be intensified after the 2026 midterms? If Democrats don't win many seats in the House, if they don't win the House, does Hakeem Jeffries, the current minority leader for the Democrats, does he face scrutiny? Will another party leader be pressured to represent members of the House? What about Chuck Schumer? If the Democrats keep their current makeup in the Senate, does Schumer stick around? If they lose seats, does Schumer stick around? If they win seats, does that give Schumer the ability to stick around? He could arguably go to his colleagues and say, listen, I was able to make sure that we won back the United States Senate when the odds were against us. Time is going to tell. Guys, send me a DM. You know where to find me on social media: Twitter, Broadcast Ben; Instagram, Broadcast Ben; Facebook, Broadcast Ben. The name goes on many platforms. I'm also on Substack. I'll be releasing this podcast in full in order to make sure that every week your email inbox includes a notice that this podcast is posted. But I also have direct links to the sources that I'm talking with. Again, the change makers, the analysts, the experts, in order to go beyond the headlines to figure out why they matter without spin. You know the drill. Anyway, have a great week ahead. I hope you had a fantastic holiday, restful with family, and you're feeling healthy headed into 2026. Got any New Year's resolutions? I don't. Still working on it. Take it easy, everybody.